We see a figure in a white robe standing beneath an ancient gnarled oak tree in a mist-filled forest. They seem peaceful, a keeper of wisdom. Then, the image changes. We see a Roman historian's account, describing the same figure as a savage sorcerer, a practitioner of terrifying rituals and human sacrifice in dark, forbidden groves. For 2,000 years, these two opposing images have defined the Druid. Were they the wise philosophers of the Celtic world, or were they the masters of a dark magic, rightly feared by the most powerful empire on earth? The truth is not in the middle. It is something far stranger, a secret buried in a world where the gods were real and the forest was alive. To understand the Druids, we must first forget our modern world. We must step back in time into the vast, unbroken forests of ancient Europe. Imagine a world without written laws, without giant cities of stone, without a single distant god in the sky. Your world is the forest, the river, the rolling hills, and the misty bog. This landscape is not just a place where you live. It is a living thing, a conscious being filled with countless spirits, ancient powers that were there long before your ancestors arrived. Your survival, your entire existence, depends on understanding and respecting this older, wilder world. For the Celtic people, every part of nature had a soul. The old oak tree that marked the edge of your village was not just wood. It was a silent giant, a witness to generations of your family. The river that gave you water was not just a current. It was a goddess, with her own moods and her own demands. To disrespect the river could mean a flood that destroys your home. To disrespect the oak could mean a sickness that withers your crops. This was not a superstition. It was the fundamental law of the universe, as real and as undeniable as the rising of the sun. This belief shaped every moment of a person's life. Think of a farmer. When he planted his seeds, he was not just placing them in the dirt. He was asking for a blessing from the spirit of the land itself. He might leave a small offering, a bit of bread or a splash of milk, a simple gift to show his respect. He was entering into a partnership with the earth. When a hunter tracked a deer through the forest, he would ask permission from the spirit of the woodland before taking its life. He understood that he was a guest in a home that was not his own. This world was not just alive, it was also layered. The Celts believed in a place that existed alongside our own, a realm of gods and spirits known as the Otherworld. This was not a heaven in the clouds or a hell underground. It was a perfect, magical copy of our world, hidden from us by a thin veil. It was a place where time moved differently, where there was no sickness or old age. It was beautiful and powerful, but it was also incredibly dangerous for any mortal who stumbled into it by accident. The stories were clear. Those who entered often never came back. But sometimes, you did not have to go to the otherworld. Sometimes, it came to you. There were certain places and certain times when the veil between the worlds grew thin. The misty shores of a lake at dawn, a dark cave deep in the earth, the top of a lonely hill shrouded in fog. These were known as liminal spaces, places that were neither here nor there. To stand in one of these places was to stand on the border of reality itself. It was here that you might glimpse a spirit, hear the voices of your ancestors, or feel the immense power of the unseen world. It was in these liminal spaces that what we call magic could happen. For the Celts, magic was not about creating something from nothing. It was about understanding the connection between the two worlds. It was the art of speaking across the veil, of asking for favors from the powerful beings who lived on the other side. A healer might go to a sacred spring, a place where the border was thin, to ask a water spirit for help in curing a sick child. A warrior might go to a hilltop to ask a sky god for strength in battle. Magic was communication. The gods and goddesses of the Celts were not like the gods of Rome or Greece. They did not live in distant palaces on a mountain. They were here, with the people. A tribe might have its own special god, a protector who lived in the nearby river or watched over them from a specific mountain. This god was a member of the tribe, a powerful ancestor who had to be honored and respected. Your relationship with your gods was personal. They were not abstract ideas. They were your neighbors, your guardians, and, sometimes, your most feared masters. Imagine you are a young woman living in a small village. Your family's cattle are sick, and you fear they will not survive the winter. You would not pray to a distant, all-powerful being. Instead, you would go to the ancient stone circle just outside your village, a place known to be sacred to the local land goddess. You would bring her a gift, perhaps a beautiful ribbon, or the first milk from a healthy cow. You would speak to her like a respected elder, asking for her help, promising her your loyalty. Her power was tied to this land, to your home. Because the gods were local and personal, there were thousands of them. Almost every lake, forest, and mountain in the Celtic world had its own deity, its own spirit, with its own name and personality. This may seem chaotic to us, but to the Celts, it made perfect sense. The world was a vast and complex place, filled with an endless variety of life. It was only natural that the family of the gods would be just as vast and just as varied. This vastness, however, created a problem. How did you keep all of them happy? How did you maintain the balance? The answer lay in understanding the flow of time. For the ancient Celts, time was not a straight line moving from past to future. It was a great wheel, always turning in a cycle. There was a time for birth, a time for growth, a time for harvest, and a time for death. This cycle was visible everywhere, in the passing of the seasons, in the phases of the moon, and in the life of every person. Nothing ever truly ended. It just changed form and began again. This belief was the very heart of their spiritual world. The turning of this great wheel was marked by 4 major festivals. These were the hinges of the year, moments of immense power and great danger. They were not holidays in our sense of the word. They were critical moments when the entire community had to perform the correct rituals to ensure that the wheel of time would continue to turn. If they failed, the sun might not return, the crops might not grow, and the world could be plunged into chaos. The fate of everything rested on their actions during these sacred times. The year began with Samhain, at the start of winter. This was the most important and most dangerous festival of all. For the Celts, a new day did not begin at sunrise, it began at sunset. The year, too, began with the darkness of winter. Samhain was a time of death, when the veil between our world and the other world completely dissolved. The spirits of the dead could walk among the living, and terrible creatures could cross over into our realm. It was a night of cosmic terror, but also a time to honor the ancestors who came before. Imagine the feeling in a village on the night of Samhain. The great bonfire is lit, the one fire that keeps the darkness at bay. Your family is gathered close. You tell stories of your ancestors, leaving out food for their spirits, hoping they will visit and offer their wisdom. But you also look over your shoulder into the deep, rustling darkness of the forest. You know that other, less friendly beings are also walking the land tonight. The barrier is gone. Anything is possible. Your survival depends on the protection of your community and the power of your rituals. After the dark passage of winter came Imbolc, a festival of returning light. It marked the first stirrings of spring, when the sheep began to give milk again. It was a quiet, hopeful time, a celebration of the goddess Brigid, who brought fertility and healing back to the land. Then came Beltane, the great festival of summer. This was a joyous and wild celebration of life. Great bonfires were lit, and people and their cattle would walk between them in a ritual of purification, burning away the sickness of winter and welcoming the sun's full power. Finally, there was Lughnasadh, the festival of the first harvest. It was a time to thank the gods for their bounty, a celebration of community and of the strength of the tribe's leader. It was named for the great god Lugh, the master of all skills. But even in this celebration there was a shadow. It was a reminder that the light was beginning to fade, the days were growing shorter, and the dark half of the year, with its endpoint at Samhain, was once again on its way. The wheel was always turning, and balance must always be maintained. This entire system, the living world, the other world, the thousands of local gods, and the turning wheel of time, was incredibly complex. It was a delicate web of relationships and obligations. A mistake in a ritual, a forgotten offering, an act of disrespect to a sacred place, could have devastating consequences, not just for one person, but for the entire tribe. The community needed specialists, individuals who could dedicate their entire lives to understanding this complex cosmic machine. They needed people who could see the threads of fate and keep the balance between the worlds. And so, we arrive at the Druids. The word Druid itself is believed to mean oak knower or oak seer. This name ties them directly to the most sacred tree in the Celtic world, the oak, which was seen as a gateway to the other world. The Druids were the guardians of this sacred knowledge. They were the philosophers, the scientists, the judges, and the spiritual leaders of their people. They were not just priests who performed rituals. They were the living memory of the entire culture, the keepers of the law, the genealogies of the kings, and the great epic poems. Becoming a Druid was not a matter of birth. It was a long and difficult journey that could take up to 20 years of training. Students would have to memorize an enormous amount of information, hundreds of laws, thousands of poems, complex family histories, and secret ritual knowledge. None of this was ever written down. The Druids believed that writing things down would weaken the memory and imprison the sacred knowledge. All of their wisdom was held in the minds of the living, passed down from teacher to student in an unbroken chain through the generations. This oral tradition gave the Druids immense power. In a society without books, they were the only source of knowledge. A king could not make a decision without consulting his Druid advisor. A dispute between two farmers would be settled not by a warrior, but by a Druid judge, whose knowledge of the ancient laws was absolute. Their authority was not based on wealth or military might. It was based entirely on their wisdom. To go against the word of a Druid was to go against the very order of the cosmos itself. The Druids were divided into different classes, each with a specific role. The bards were the keepers of the stories and the music. They were poets who could praise a king or destroy his reputation with a single, magically charged satire. The ovates were the seers and the healers. They studied the natural world, understood the secrets of plants, and could read the future in the flight of birds or the patterns of the clouds. They were the ones who sought messages from the other world, interpreting the signs and symbols that connected the two realities. And above them all were the Druids themselves, the highest class. They were the masters of philosophy, law, and ritual. They presided over the most important ceremonies and held the ultimate authority. They were not just advisors to kings. They were often more powerful than the kings they served. A king ruled the people, but the Druids were seen as the representatives of the gods on earth. They understood the great cosmic laws, and it was their duty to ensure that human society lived in harmony with them. Their word was final. Imagine a tribal gathering. Two chieftains are arguing over a piece of land. Swords are being drawn, and a battle seems near. But then, a Druid steps between them. He wears a simple white robe, perhaps holding a staff of yew wood. He does not shout. He speaks quietly, but everyone falls silent to listen. He recites the ancient law that governs such disputes, a law that has been passed down for centuries. His judgment is not questioned. The chieftains put away their swords. The Druid has prevented a war, not with force, but with knowledge. The Druids were also the teachers of the noble youth. The sons of kings and chieftains would be sent to study with the Druids, to learn the laws of the tribe and the history of their people. This gave the Druids profound influence over the next generation of leaders. They could shape the minds of future kings, ensuring that the sacred traditions would be respected and that the balance between the human world and the world of the gods would be maintained. They were the glue that held Celtic society together. Because of their deep connection to the other world, the Druids were believed to have special powers. These powers were the source of what the Romans called their dark magic. But for the Celts, it was not dark. It was a natural result of their deep understanding. The Druids could, it was said, control the weather. They could summon a thick fog to hide an army, or call down a storm to frighten their enemies. This was not seen as breaking the laws of nature, but as asking the spirits of the air and the sky for their help. They were also masters of prophecy. A Druid could look into the embers of a sacred fire or the reflection in a bowl of water and see things that were yet to come. This was a vital skill for a king about to go into battle. The Druid could tell him the most fortunate day to attack or warn him of a hidden danger. This ability to see across time came from their understanding that time was a circle. The past, present, and future were all connected, and a person with the right training could learn to see the patterns. The Druids also practiced a form of magic involving spoken words. They believed that certain poems and chants, when spoken with the right intention and power, could have a real effect on the world. A poem of praise, a glam daisen, could bring a person good fortune and a strong reputation, but a poem of satire, an air, was considered a terrible weapon. It was a magic curse that could bring shame, bad luck, and even physical sickness upon its target. A person's reputation was everything, and the bards, under the Druids, held the power to create or destroy it. Imagine a proud and arrogant chieftain who has broken a sacred law. The tribe's Druid composes a satire against him. It is not just an insult, it is a carefully crafted magical curse. The poem speaks of the chieftain's greed and dishonor. As it is recited in front of the tribe, the chieftain feels a deep sense of shame. Soon after, his cattle begin to die. His luck in battle turns sour. The community shuns him. The magic of the Druid's words has eroded his power, isolating him and restoring the tribe's moral balance without a single weapon being drawn. Their most central belief, the one that Roman writers found most strange, was the idea of reincarnation. The Druids taught that the soul does not die with the body. Instead, after death, it passes from one body to another. This was not a punishment or a reward. It was simply the way the universe worked, part of the great cycle of life, death, and rebirth. This belief had a profound effect on the Celtic worldview. It made them fearless in battle because they did not see death as a final end. To a Celtic warrior, death in battle was not a tragedy to be feared above all else. It was a transition. He believed his spirit would simply move on, perhaps to be born again into his own tribe, to live another life among his own people. This did not mean he was careless with his life, but it did mean that he valued honor and courage more than a long existence. The Druids taught that a life lived with honor was what mattered, not the number of years a person was alive. The soul was eternal, but your actions in this life were what defined you. This brings us to the darkest part of the Druids' reputation, the accusation of human sacrifice. Roman writers like Julius Caesar wrote shocking accounts of the Druids performing massive ritual killings. He described giant figures made of wicker, filled with living men, which were then set on fire. These horrifying images have defined our view of the Druids for centuries. But were these accounts true? Or were they propaganda, written by an enemy general trying to make his opponents look like savages who deserve to be conquered? The answer is deeply complex. First, we must understand the Roman point of view. To the Romans, their conquest of new lands was not just about power. They believed it was about bringing civilization to barbarians. By portraying the Druids as masters of a brutal, bloodthirsty religion, Caesar could justify his violent campaigns to the Senate back in Rome. He was not just conquering a new territory, he was saving people from the horror of their own priests. It was a powerful political tool that painted the Romans as liberators, not invaders. Archaeological evidence for human sacrifice in Celtic Europe is rare, but it does exist. In bogs, bodies have been found that show signs of ritual killing. These bog bodies are remarkably preserved, and they often show that the person was killed in multiple ways, a sign that their death was not a simple murder, but something with deep symbolic meaning. These were likely not common events, but rare and extreme rituals performed at times of great crises, like a famine or the threat of invasion. They were desperate acts in a desperate world. If these sacrifices did happen, we must try to understand them from the Celtic perspective, not our own. To them, the world was a system of balance and exchange. If you took something from the land, you had to give something back. In the most extreme circumstances, when the tribe faced total destruction, the most powerful gift you could offer the gods was a human life. The person chosen was likely not seen as a victim in our sense. They may have been a captive, or even a volunteer, whose death was seen as a noble sacrifice to save the entire community. Think of it from the viewpoint of a person living through a terrible drought. The crops are failing, the cattle are dying, and the children are starving. The tribe has tried every other ritual and offered every other gift to the gods, but nothing has worked. The world is out of balance. The Druids declare that the ultimate gift is required to restore it. The death of one person, however terrible, is weighed against the death of the entire tribe. In their world, this was a grim and terrifying but logical calculation made to restore cosmic order. The Druids' power was absolute, but it depended entirely on the world staying the same. It was a system built on ancient traditions, oral knowledge, and a deep connection to the land. But a new force was spreading across the continent. It came from Rome. This force did not just bring armies with swords and shields. It brought a new way of thinking. It brought written laws, new gods, and a deep distrust of the wild, untamed magic of the Celtic world. The Romans saw the Druids not as keepers of wisdom, but as a direct threat to their authority and their way of life. When the Romans conquered a new land, they would often absorb the local gods into their own system. They would say that a Celtic god of the sky was just another name for their god, Jupiter. This allowed local people to continue their worship while still being part of the Roman Empire. But they could not do this with the Druids. The Druids were not just priests. They were the political and legal center of Celtic society. Their power was a rival to Roman power. To control the Celtic tribes, Rome knew it had to destroy the Druids completely. The conflict came to a head on the island of Anglesey, off the coast of Wales. This island was a sacred stronghold of the Druids. In the year 60 AD, the Roman governor of Britain, Suetonius Paulinus, led his legions to the island with the specific goal of wiping them out. What the Roman soldiers saw when they landed shocked even them, men who were used to the violence of war. They saw an army of Celtic warriors, but among them were women in black robes, screaming curses, and the white-robed Druids, standing with their hands raised to the sky, calling upon their gods to strike down the invaders. For a moment, the Roman soldiers were frozen with fear. This was not a normal battle. It felt like they were fighting against the forces of magic itself. But their general urged them forward. The disciplined Roman army crashed into the Celtic lines. The battle was a brutal massacre. The Romans showed no mercy. They cut down the warriors and the priests alike. Afterwards, they marched to the sacred groves of the Druids, the holy places where their most secret rituals were held. What the Romans did next was a deliberate act of destruction aimed at the very soul of the Celtic religion. They cut down the sacred oak trees, they destroyed the altars. They burned the sacred groves to the ground. This was more than just a military victory. It was a cultural and spiritual execution. By destroying the most sacred place in Britain, the Romans sent a clear message to all the Celtic tribes. Your gods have no power here. Your wise men are dead. Your world is over. Rome is your new master. The massacre at Anglesey was a devastating blow from which the Druids would never fully recover, at least not in their original form. They were hunted across the Roman Empire. Their practices were outlawed. The very word Druid became associated with rebellion and forbidden magic. The Romans systematically replaced the Druids oral law with their own written legal code. They replaced the Celtic gods with the Roman pantheon. The organized, powerful institution of the Druids was broken. They were forced to go into hiding, to practice their beliefs in secret, away from the watchful eyes of the Roman authorities. But an idea is harder to kill than a person. The Druids were gone as a formal class, but the beliefs they taught lived on in the hearts of the people. The local farmer still left an offering at the sacred spring. The village storyteller still told the ancient myths of the gods and heroes. The fundamental Celtic worldview, the belief in a living landscape and a nearby otherworld, did not just disappear. It went underground, surviving in folk traditions and local customs. The official power of the Druids was destroyed, but their spirit lingered in the mist and the ancient stones of the land. Generations passed. The Roman Empire rose to its greatest height and then began to crumble. The legions that had once seemed invincible were called back to defend the heart of the empire, and lands like Britain were left to fend for themselves. Into this power vacuum, new peoples came. Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, and other Germanic tribes migrated to the island, bringing their own gods and their own beliefs. It was a time of chaos and conflict, with old Celtic kingdoms fighting against these new invaders. The world was changing once again. And then, another new belief arrived. It came not with an army, but with quiet missionaries. This was Christianity. It told the story of a single, all-powerful God, a world created in 7 days, and a life that was not a repeating circle, but a straight line leading to a final judgment of heaven or hell. This new faith was fundamentally different from the old Celtic ways. It had no room for thousands of local gods, no place for a living landscape, and it saw the other world not as a parallel reality, but as the domain of demons. The conversion of the Celtic lands to Christianity was a long and complex process. It was not always a story of violent conflict. Often, it was a story of blending and adaptation. The early Christian missionaries were clever. They understood that you could not simply erase 1,000 years of belief overnight. Instead of destroying the sacred places of the old religion, they often built their new churches on top of them. A sacred spring once dedicated to a Celtic goddess might be rededicated to the Virgin Mary. The old power of the place was not erased, but redirected. The old festivals were also transformed. The winter festival of Yule, with its focus on rebirth and returning light, was blended with the celebration of Christmas. The spring festival of Yulestri, dedicated to a goddess of the dawn, gave its name to Easter. The festival of Samhain, the night when the dead walked the earth, became All Hallows' Eve, the night before All Saints' Day. The old ways were not completely forgotten. They were given new names and new meanings, allowing people to hold on to their ancient traditions while embracing the new faith. This is where the story of the Druid truly transforms. In the newly Christian lands of Ireland, which had never been conquered by Rome, a unique situation occurred. Here, the learned class who had once been the Druids did not completely vanish. Instead, they slowly became something else. The keepers of the epic poems, the bards, continued to tell their stories, but now they told them in monasteries. Christian monks became the new scribes, the new keepers of knowledge. And it is because of them that we know anything at all about Celtic mythology. These Irish monks began the monumental task of writing down the old stories for the first time. But they faced a problem. How could they, as good Christians, write about the thousands of pagan gods their ancestors had worshipped? They came up with a brilliant solution. In their versions of the myths, they demoted the old gods. They were no longer described as all-powerful deities. Instead, they became magical kings and queens from a long-lost past, or they were transformed into the fair folk, the powerful supernatural beings living in the other world. The great god Lugh, the master of all skills, became Lugh of the Long Arm, a legendary warrior king. The powerful goddesses of the land were reimagined as otherworldly queens or as powerful sorceresses. In this way, the stories could be preserved without directly challenging the new Christian faith. It was an act of incredible cultural preservation. The monks saved the memory of their ancestors' world, but they also changed it forever, filtering it through a new set of beliefs. The gods became fairies, and the Druids became wizards and enchanters. And it is here, in these ancient manuscripts written by monks, that we find the true source of what we think of as Druid magic. The historical Druids, the priests and judges, were mostly gone. In their place was a new figure, the Druid of myth. This was a character in the great epic tales, a figure of immense power, a master of illusion and prophecy, an advisor to kings who could shapeshift and control the elements. This was not the historical truth, but a memory transformed into a legend. But what did this legendary magic actually look like? In the old Irish stories, the magic of the Druids was often a magic of the mind and the senses. One of their most famous abilities was the fifth fath, or the cloak of mists. This was not a physical cloak, but a powerful spell of concealment. A druid could chant a specific incantation and create a magical fog so thick that it would make a person, or even an entire army, completely invisible to their enemies. This was a powerful tool in a world of constant tribal warfare. It allowed a small group of warriors to sneak up on a much larger force, or it could help a hero escape from a seemingly impossible situation. Imagine you are a warrior, standing on a hill, looking down at the enemy camp below. You are outnumbered 10 to 1. Your king turns to his druid. The druid begins to chant, his voice low and rhythmic. Slowly, a thick, unnatural mist begins to roll in from the hills, clinging to the ground. It wraps around you and your fellow soldiers, not cold and wet, but silent and strange. You can see your friends next to you perfectly, but when you look out, the world is gone, replaced by a gray wall. You are now invisible, a ghost army about to descend upon your unsuspecting foes. Another key magical art was shapeshifting. The Druids, and many of the gods and heroes in the myths, could change their physical form, often into an animal. This was not just a disguise. By becoming an eagle, they could see the world from above. By becoming a salmon, they could swim into the other world through a sacred river and gain secret knowledge. By becoming a boar, they could gain immense strength and ferocity. Each animal form had its own specific power and wisdom, and a master shapeshifter could use these abilities to accomplish incredible feats that were impossible for any normal human. The stories are filled with these transformations. A famous tale tells of two powerful figures who engage in a magical duel, changing from one form to another. They become stags, then boars, then great birds of prey, fighting across the land, sea, and sky. To the people who heard these tales, this was not just an entertaining fantasy. It was a story that reinforced their deepest belief that the line between human and animal, between this world and the other world, was not a solid wall. It was a fluid boundary that the wise and the powerful could learn to cross. Perhaps the most subtle and powerful form of Druid magic was the geis. A geis was a magical command, a bond, or a prohibition placed upon a person. It was a sacred rule that they could not break. It might be something simple, like never eat the meat of a dog, or something complex, like never refuse a request for hospitality. As long as the person obeyed their geis, they might be granted special protection or good fortune. But if they were ever tricked or forced into breaking it, disaster was sure to follow. Their luck would vanish, and their downfall would be certain. Think of a great hero, like the famous Cuchulainn. He was bound by several geasa. One was that he could not eat the flesh of a dog, as the dog was his namesake animal. Another was that he could not refuse a meal offered to him by a woman. One day, on his way to his final battle, an old woman by the side of the road offers him a meal of cooked dog meat. He is trapped. To refuse the meal would break one geis, but to accept it would break another. he chooses to eat, breaking his sacred bond. From that moment on, his power begins to fade, leading to his tragic death. The Druids of myth were also masters of the elements. They could call up great winds to scatter an enemy fleet of ships. They could summon a magical fire that could not be put out with water. They could cause snow to fall in the middle of summer to confuse an invading army. This power came from their deep connection to the living world. They did not command nature as a master commands a slave. Instead, they were seen as speaking to the spirits of the wind, the fire, and the storm, respectfully asking for their aid in a time of great need. One famous story tells of the arrival of a new group of people in Ireland. To stop them from landing, the Druids of the tribe already living there summon a great storm. The sea rises up in giant waves, and the wind howls like a demon. But the invaders have a powerful poet-seer of their own. He chants a magical poem to the land of Ireland itself, calming the storm and allowing their ships to reach the shore safely. This was a battle fought not just with swords, but with magic and poetry, a contest to see who had the deeper understanding of the land's secret power. Prophecy was a central part of the mythical Druids' role. They had many methods for seeing the future. They might chew on a piece of raw meat in a special ritual and fall into a trance, seeing visions of what was to come. They might listen to the chatter of birds, or the sound of the wind in the trees, interpreting the patterns as messages from the other world. They also used a system of writing called ogam, which was carved into sticks. By drawing these sticks at random, they could divine the outcome of a battle or the fate of a king. Let us return to the figure of Cathbad, the chief druid in the court of King Conchobar. One day, he is asked by a group of young warriors which of them will become the most famous. Cathbad looks at the signs in the sky and prophesies that any warrior who takes up arms for the first time on that specific day will have a life of glorious fame, but it will be a very short one. The young hero Cuchulainn overhears this. He immediately goes to the king and demands his first weapons, choosing a short life of eternal glory over a long life of obscurity. This story shows the immense weight of a druid's words. Cathbad's prophecy does not just predict the future, it helps to create it. It sets a path for the young hero, a destiny that he then chooses to fulfill. For the people hearing this tale, it was a powerful lesson. The future was not entirely fixed. It was a series of paths, and the Druids were the ones who could see the map. They could show you where each path led, but the choice of which one to walk was still your own. This made their wisdom both a gift and a heavy burden. The Druids' magic was not always used for good. In the myths, there are dark Druids, figures who use their power for revenge or to aid cruel kings. One of the most feared figures was Mug Ruith, a blind druid of immense power. It was said he could turn to stone anyone who looked at him. He had a magical shield that could create a dark cloud to block out the sun, and he could breathe a magical breath that would turn into a fiery storm, destroying everything in its path. This shows that the power itself was neutral. It was the intention of the user that made it light or dark. The presence of these darker figures is important. It reminds us that the Celtic world was not a peaceful utopia. It was a hard and often brutal place. Magic was a weapon, just like a sword or an axe. A chieftain would value his druid not just for his wisdom, but for the magical power he could bring to a battle. The ability to create an illusion, to curse an enemy, or to predict their movements was a real tactical advantage. The druid was a key part of the tribe's war machine, a spiritual weapon as important as the champion warrior. This mythical druid also had a deep connection to justice. Their judgment was believed to be divinely inspired. One famous story tells of a king who gives a false judgment. Immediately, the side of his face becomes twisted and blemished. In Celtic culture, a king had to be physically perfect. Any blemish was a sign that his rule was unjust and that the land itself was suffering because of it. the king is forced to give up his throne. The land's fertility and the king's justice were magically linked, and the Druids were the guardians of this sacred connection. Imagine you are a simple farmer, and your powerful neighbor has stolen your best cow. You have no army, no wealth. But you can go to the Druid. You can ask for a judgment based on the ancient, sacred law. The Druid listens to both sides. He does not care about your neighbor's power or wealth. He only cares about the truth and the balance of things. When he makes his judgment, it is final. Everyone in the tribe, even the powerful neighbor, must respect it. To defy the Druid would be to defy the gods and risk bringing a curse upon the entire community. The Druids of myth were also deeply tied to the symbolism of the head. The Celts believed the soul resided in the head, and it was a source of great spiritual power. After a battle, warriors would often take the heads of their enemies. This was not just a gruesome trophy. They believed it captured the spirit and power of the defeated foe. These heads would be displayed at the entrance to their settlements, a practice they believed would protect the tribe from evil spirits. The Druids understood and guided these rituals, seeing the head as a magical object. So the mythical Druid was a complex figure, a wizard, a prophet, a judge, and a philosopher all in one. They could be a wise advisor, guiding a just king and ensuring the prosperity of the land. Or they could be a terrifying sorcerer, calling down storms and laying inescapable curses upon their enemies. They were the masters of the unseen, the interpreters of the hidden language of the universe. Their power was not supernatural in our sense of the word. It was a deep and profound naturalism, an understanding of a world far more alive and conscious than our own. It is crucial to remember that these incredible stories were written down hundreds of years after the historical Druids had vanished from most of Europe. They were recorded by Christian monks. These monks looked back at their own pre-Christian past with a mixture of fascination and disapproval. They were preserving the memory of their ancestors, but they were also framing it for a new Christian audience. The Druids in their stories became the ultimate symbols of the old pagan world. Powerful magicians who would ultimately have to face a new and greater power. For a person living in early Christian Ireland, hearing these stories was a way of connecting to their heritage while also reinforcing their new faith. They could marvel at the magical feats of the great Druids of the past, seeing them as mighty figures from a heroic age. But the stories would always end with the subtle message that this old magic, however powerful, was ultimately replaced by the miracles of the new religion. The Druid became a legendary figure, a wizard from a lost time, whose power had faded with the coming of the saints. And so, the image of the Druid was split in two. There was the real historical figure, the priest and judge whose power was destroyed by the Romans. And there was the legendary figure, the all-powerful wizard from the myths recorded by the monks. This legendary Druid, the master of shape-shifting and illusion, became the one who survived in the popular imagination. But this raises a fascinating question. What happened when the world of these new Christian saints directly collided with the world of the old Druidic magic? The legends tell of a great magical showdown. The story takes place in the 5th century AD at the court of the High King of Ireland, Loomer MacNeil. This was still a pagan kingdom, and the king's chief advisor was his most powerful druid. The king had decreed that during the great spring festival of Beltane, no fire could be lit anywhere in the land until the great ceremonial bonfire was first lit on the sacred hill of Tara, the center of royal power. To light a fire before the kings was an act of defiance, a direct challenge to his authority and the authority of his gods. But on the eve of the festival, the king and his druids looked out from the hill of Tara, and to their astonishment, they saw a single fire burning brightly on the nearby hill of Slain. The king was furious. Who would dare to defy him in this way? His druids were deeply troubled. They told the king, "O king, this fire that we see, if it is not put out tonight, it will never be put out in Ireland. It will rise above all the fires of our tradition, and the man who has lit it will overcome us all. The man who had lit the fire was St. Patrick. He had returned to Ireland, the land where he had once been a slave, to bring the Christian faith to the people. He chose to light the Paschal fire, the sacred fire of Easter, on this night to create a direct and public challenge to the power of the king and his Druids. He knew that this act would force a confrontation. He was deliberately opposing the most sacred ritual of the old religion with the most sacred ritual of the new one. It was a declaration of spiritual war. The king, accompanied by his warriors and his Druids, went down from Tara to confront this stranger. The legends say the Druids warned the king not to go to the fire himself, but to have Patrick brought to him. They feared the power of the place where the new fire burned. When Patrick was brought before the king, the confrontation began. It was not a debate of ideas. In the story, it is a contest of magic versus miracles, a battle between the power of the Druids and the power of the Christian God. One of the king's Druids, a man named Loomer, began to insult Patrick and his faith. He used his magic to try and intimidate the holy man. But Patrick, according to the legend, prayed to his God. A great power came upon him, and he cursed the Druid. A mysterious force lifted the Druid into the air, then dashed him against a rock, killing him instantly. The warriors of the king were terrified. They had just witnessed their powerful magician being struck down with what seemed to be a single word. Their belief in the old ways was shaken. Another Druid then stepped forward to challenge Patrick. This time, the contest was one of elemental power. The Druid used his incantations to summon a deep, magical darkness that covered the entire land, even though it was daytime. He blotted out the sun, trying to prove that his gods controlled the forces of nature. The people cried out in fear, but Patrick simply prayed, and the darkness instantly vanished, and the sun shone brightly once again. His power appeared to be greater than the Druids. One by one, the Druids' magical attacks were defeated. The final contest was a trial by fire. A hut was built, half of it from green, wet wood, and half from dry wood. The king's remaining chief Druid went into the half made of green wood, protected only by Patrick's cloak. One of Patrick's young followers went into the half made of dry wood, protected by the Druid's magical cloak. The hut was then set on fire. When the flames died down, a strange sight was revealed. The Druid had been burned to ashes, but Patrick's cloak was untouched. The young Christian was unharmed, but the Druid's cloak he wore had been completely destroyed. Now, is this story a literal historical account of what happened? Almost certainly not. It is a legend, a piece of powerful storytelling written by Christians long after the events. Its purpose was not to record history accurately. Its purpose was to explain, in a dramatic and memorable way, how Christianity had triumphed over the old pagan religion. It was a story designed to show that the God of the new faith was more powerful than all the magic of the old world. The Druid in the story is a symbol of everything that was being replaced. But the story is still incredibly valuable. It shows us how the people of that time understood the conflict. They did not see it as a simple change in belief. They saw it as a real struggle between competing powers. For a person in that world, magic was real. Miracles were real. The world was full of unseen forces. The question was not, do these powers exist? The question was, whose power is greater? This legend provided a clear and powerful answer, making the Druids seem like powerful but ultimately flawed magicians who were defeated by a divine truth. As Christianity spread across the Celtic lands, the image of the Druid continued to change. They were no longer seen as respected keepers of wisdom. In the eyes of the Church, their knowledge was demonic, their gods were devils in disguise, and their magic was a dark art that threatened the souls of good Christian folk. Any lingering folk traditions that hinted at the old ways were viewed with deep suspicion. The ancient sacred groves were either cut down or had crosses placed in them to cleanse them of their pagan past. The old world was being systematically overwritten. The bards, the poet class that had once been part of the Druidic order, survived longer than the priests. Kings and chieftains still needed poets to praise their deeds and record their family history, but even their role changed. They were absorbed into the Christian world, often living and working in monasteries. They continued to tell the old stories, but they were careful to frame them in a way that did not conflict with their new religion. They became entertainers and historians, but their role as sacred magical figures slowly faded away. In Wales, the tradition of the bards remained incredibly strong. Here, figures like Taliesin, a legendary poet, were remembered as having supernatural knowledge and prophetic abilities. He was not called a druid, but his character in the stories carried many of the same qualities: a deep connection to the otherworld, the ability to see the future, and a mastery of words that held magical power. The form had changed, the name was different, but the ancient idea of a wise seer who understood the secrets of the universe was still alive in the culture. Over the centuries, the real Druids were almost completely forgotten by the general population. What remained were the legends, the folk tales, and the warnings from the church. The Druid became a figure of folklore, a mysterious wizard who lived deep in the forest, sometimes helping lost travelers, other times casting wicked spells. They were often confused with other magical figures, like the enchanter Merlin from the tales of King Arthur. Merlin, who could shapeshift, see the future, and advise a great king, was in many ways a direct literary descendant of the mythical Druids of Ireland. Imagine a medieval peasant gathering firewood in the forest. He remembers the stories his grandmother told him, stories of the fair folk who live in the ancient hills, the earthen mounds that were once the centers of pre-Christian worship. He remembers the church priest warning him that these are not gentle spirits, but demons who will try to trick him and steal his soul. The forest, which for his distant ancestors was a living, conscious place full of gods, has now become a place of fear, a dark and dangerous wilderness where the remnants of a defeated, evil religion still lurk. This fear was a powerful tool. By associating all the old beliefs with dark magic and demonic forces, the church could more easily control the spiritual lives of the people. The old ways were not just wrong, they were dangerous. To leave an offering at a well was no longer an act of respect for a water spirit. It was an act of devil worship. This process of reframing the past was incredibly successful. For over 1,000 years, the Druid was remembered not as a philosopher or a judge, but as a dark sorcerer from a barbaric past. Then came the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment. Scholars began to rediscover the classical texts of Greek and Roman writers. They read Julius Caesar's accounts of the Gauls and his descriptions of the Druids. At the same time, a new sense of national identity was growing in places like England, Wales, and Scotland. People began to look back into their own deep past, before the Romans and before Christianity, searching for the roots of their own unique cultures. They were looking for a history that was not Roman or Catholic, but truly their own. In the 18th century, a new and very different image of the Druid began to emerge. A group of scholars and romantics, particularly in Britain, began to look at the Druids in a new light. They dismissed the Roman accounts of human sacrifice as propaganda. Instead, they focused on the idea of the Druids as wise, peaceful philosophers, the noble savages of ancient Britain. They imagined them as priests of a pure, natural religion who worshipped a single god and understood the great secrets of the universe, much like the ancient Egyptians or the sages of India. An English scholar named William Stukeley became fascinated with the great stone circles of Stonehenge in Avebury. He was convinced that these ancient monuments could not have been built by savages. They must have been built by a sophisticated priesthood. He incorrectly concluded that they were temples built by the Druids. This idea was incredibly powerful and captured the public imagination. The image of white-robed Druids, gathering at sunrise at Stonehenge to perform mystical ceremonies, was born. This image has almost no connection to historical reality, but it has been incredibly enduring. This Druid revival created a completely new kind of Druid. People formed fraternal orders and societies based on their romantic ideas of what the ancient Druids were like. They created new rituals, new philosophies, and new ceremonies, often inspired by a mixture of old Welsh poetry, Masonic traditions, and a romantic love of nature. This was not an attempt to recreate the ancient religion exactly. That was impossible, as so little information had survived. Instead, it was an attempt to capture what they saw as the spirit of the Druids, wisdom, a connection to nature, and a search for spiritual truth. So now we have three different Druids. First, the historical Druid of the Iron Age, the powerful priest, judge, and political advisor who was wiped out by the Romans. Second, the mythical Druid of the medieval legends, the powerful wizard and shapeshifter who fought against the saints. And third, the romantic Druid of the 18th century revival, the peaceful, white-robed sage who built Stonehenge and worshipped nature. Each one tells us more about the time that created it than about the original Druids themselves. The Druid has become a mirror, reflecting our own changing ideas about the past. But beneath all these layers of history and legend, the core concept of what we call Druid magic remained surprisingly consistent. It was never about fireballs and lightning bolts from the fingertips. It was always about a deeper, more intimate kind of power. It was the power of connection. It was the understanding that the rain, the stone, the tree, and the human mind were all part of one single, living system. The magic was in knowing the secret language that connected all the pieces together. It was the art of seeing the hidden patterns in the world. Think about what it would feel like to truly live with that belief. When you walked through the forest, you would not feel alone. You would feel surrounded by countless intelligences, some friendly, some dangerous, all ancient. You would see the world not as a collection of objects, but as a community of beings. Your own thoughts and words would feel heavier, more important. You would understand that a spoken promise was a real, binding force, and a curse was a tangible weapon that could be sent out into the world to do harm. This belief in the power of words, of spoken incantations and poetry, is perhaps the most authentic magical tradition we can trace back to the ancient Celtic world. The Druids were masters of the spoken word. They could weave language into a glamour, an illusion that would trick the senses. They could craft a satire so sharp that it could ruin a person's reputation and bring them bad luck. They understood that language did not just describe reality, it had the power to shape it. This was their truest and most potent form of magic. This power was not something available only to a select few priests. It was part of the fabric of everyday life. A mother might whisper a charm over her sick child to protect them. A farmer might chant a traditional rhyme as he sowed his fields to ensure a good harvest. A blacksmith would know the right words to say to the fire and the iron to make his tools strong. This was not dark magic. It was a practical, everyday way of interacting with a world that was believed to be alive and listening. Over time, as the old world faded, this belief in the power of charms and curses lingered in folklore. The complex philosophy of the Druids was gone, but this simple, powerful idea remained. People continued to believe in the evil eye, in lucky charms, and in the idea that certain people could bless or curse you. The grand magic of the Druids, which once decided the fate of kings and armies, was scaled down, surviving in the quiet superstitions and folk remedies of village life, a faint echo of a time when the world worked differently. And so, the Druids' dark magic, as the Romans called it, was never truly about evil. It was about knowledge. It was the knowledge of a world where the veil between the physical and the spiritual was thin. It was the knowledge of how to speak to the spirits of the land, how to understand the turning of the great wheel of time, and how to see the invisible threads of fate that connected everything. To the Romans, who saw the world in a very different way, this knowledge was terrifying. It was an unpredictable power that they could not control. For the Celts, this power was simply the way the world was. The Druids were the ones who had studied it the longest, who understood it the most deeply. They were the scientists of their day, but their subject was not just the material world. It was the entire cosmos, seen and unseen. Their rituals were their experiments, their myths were their textbooks, and their magic was their technology. It was a complete system of understanding reality, one that had served their people for 1,000 years before the first Roman legion ever arrived. This system was finally broken not by a superior magic, but by a superior force of arms and a new religion that completely redefined the world. Christianity did not just defeat the Druids, it erased the very landscape in which their power made sense. It replaced the thousands of local spirits with a single, universal God. It replaced the cyclical view of time with a linear one. It made the other world into a place of demons. It took the magic out of the world and placed all power in the hands of a single, distant deity. The transformation was almost total. But the memory of the Druids, though twisted and changed, never completely disappeared. It survived in the epic poems of Ireland, in the legends of Welsh bards, in the romantic fantasies of 18th century scholars, and even in the folk magic of isolated villages. The figure of the Druid haunted the imagination of Europe, a symbol of a lost connection to a wilder, more magical past. They became a legend, a story we told ourselves about a time when the world was enchanted. We have seen the real Druid, the mythical Druid, and the romantic Druid. We have journeyed from the sacred groves of the Iron Age to the courts of Irish kings and the stone circles of the English imagination. We have seen how a powerful priesthood was transformed into a legend of wizards and sorcerers. But we still have not answered our first, most startling question. We see figures in white robes and speak of their wisdom, but the Romans spoke of human sacrifice. How did this terrifying accusation become the most persistent and darkest part of their magic? To understand the darkness attached to the Druids, we must return to its source, the Roman writers. The most influential was Julius Caesar. He was not a neutral observer, he was a general conducting a brutal military campaign. And his writings were reports sent back to Rome to justify his actions and build his political career. He needed an enemy that was both formidable and barbaric. The Druids, as the intellectual and spiritual leaders of the Celtic resistance, were the perfect target for this character assassination. Their secret knowledge and immense influence made them a threat that had to be neutralized. Caesar's most shocking claim was the Wicker Man. He described enormous figures woven from branches, their limbs filled with living people, which were then set ablaze as a sacrifice to the gods. This image is pure horror. It is an image of industrial-scale human sacrifice, designed to shock and disgust his Roman audience. It painted the Celts not as a culture with a different religion, but as monstrous savages who needed to be conquered for their own good. But in all of archaeology, across the entire Celtic world, not a single piece of physical evidence for these wicker men has ever been found. This lack of evidence has led many historians to believe the Wicker Man was either a gross exaggeration or a complete fabrication. It's possible Caesar witnessed the burning of large wicker effigies as part of a festival, and, either through misunderstanding or deliberate propaganda, reported that they were filled with people. It is also possible he was repeating a sensational rumor he had heard from a captured soldier. Whatever the truth, the story served its purpose perfectly. It created a powerful and lasting image of Druidic cruelty that has haunted their reputation for 2,000 years. Another Roman writer, Tacitus, described the final stand of the Druids on Anglesey. He wrote that their sacred groves were drenched with the blood of prisoners. He claimed their altars were soaked in the gore of human sacrifice. Again, we must consider the source. Tacitus was writing about a brutal battle, the final extermination of the Druidic leadership in Britain. His description serves to justify the Roman army's actions. The Romans were not committing a massacre. They were cleansing the world of a depraved and bloodthirsty cult. They were the forces of order wiping out the agents of chaos. Imagine being a Roman senator reading these reports. You hear of strange priests in dark forests holding secret ceremonies. You hear of them wielding a mysterious power over their people. a power that fuels rebellion against your legions. And then you read of giant burning men and blood-soaked altars. Your fear and suspicion are confirmed. These are not a people you can negotiate with. They are fanatics led by monsters. The decision to fund the next stage of the conquest becomes much easier. The propaganda has done its work, turning a political enemy into a moral one. The reality of Celtic ritual killing, as suggested by the rare bog bodies, was likely far different. These were not frequent public spectacles. They were solemn, deeply significant events, probably reserved for the most extreme crises. The person sacrificed may have been seen as a messenger to the other world, a sacred offering to restore balance to the cosmos. It was a terrifying act, born of desperation. The Romans took this rare, extreme practice and portrayed it as a common, everyday feature of Druidic religion, transforming a grim necessity into a monstrous appetite for cruelty. When the Roman Empire eventually became Christian, this anti-Druid propaganda was not discarded. It was adopted and given a new, even darker meaning. The Church Fathers read the old Roman accounts. To them, the gods the Druids were sacrificing to were not just foreign deities. They were demons. The sacrifices were not just barbaric acts. They were acts of devil worship. The Druids were transformed from savage priests into satanic sorcerers, practitioners of the blackest arts who dealt with the forces of hell itself to gain their power. This new interpretation was taught to the newly converted people of the Celtic lands. Imagine a grandmother telling her grandchild a story she heard as a child, a myth about the old gods. The grandchild, who has been taught by the new priests, is now afraid. He has been told that these are not tales of heroes and magic, but stories of demons who demanded blood. The old ways were now coated in a layer of profound spiritual terror. To even think about them was to risk the eternal damnation of your soul. A wedge was driven between the people and their own ancestral past. This belief is powerfully illustrated in the lives of the early saints. Many stories tell of saints traveling through the countryside and encountering pagan practices. A famous story about Saint Columba describes him interrupting a group of Druids who were about to sacrifice a young boy to bless a new fortress. The saint intervenes, performs a miracle, and saves the boy, demonstrating the power of the Christian God over the old, bloodthirsty religion. These stories became powerful tools for conversion, portraying the new faith as a force of mercy and light against the darkness of the pagan past. Whether these events actually happened is not the point. The stories themselves show the new reality. The Druid, or any figure representing the old pagan priesthood, was now cast in the role of the villain. They were the ones who demanded the innocent victim, and the saint was the hero who saved them. This narrative was repeated again and again, in sermons and in stories, until the association between the old religion and human sacrifice was unbreakable. The Druid was no longer just an enemy of the state, as they were for Rome. They were now an enemy of God. This demonization had a chilling effect on the preservation of knowledge. The Christian monks who wrote down the old myths had to be extremely careful. Any direct mention of sacrifice to the old gods was dangerous, so they often removed it or changed it. If a story required a sacrifice, it was often the work of a wicked king or an evil sorcerer, not a respected religious ritual. The act was divorced from its original context of cosmic balance and was reframed as a simple act of evil, further darkening the memory of their pre-Christian ancestors and their spiritual leaders. As the Middle Ages progressed, the specific figure of the Druid faded even further from memory, but the fear they had come to represent did not. The idea of dark, secret rituals performed in the wilderness to gain power from evil spirits became a central part of European folklore. The figure of the Druid essentially dissolved, and its darkest elements were absorbed into the emerging figure of the witch. The witch, who made a pact with the devil, who stole babies for their dark rituals, and who met in secret covens in the forest, was the new heir to the Druid's dark reputation. Think of a medieval peasant. He has likely never heard the word Druid, but he knows that you do not go into the deep woods on certain nights. He knows that the old stone circle on the hill is a dangerous place, a place where evil things once happened and might happen again. He has heard tales of witches who gather there to chant to their dark master. The fear, originally manufactured by Roman generals and amplified by Christian priests, has now become part of the soil, a piece of folk wisdom whose origins have been completely forgotten. This deep, lingering fear of ancient places is a ghost of the old propaganda. The sacred grove of the Druids, once the center of the community's spiritual life, became the haunted forest of fairy tales. The stone circle, once a place of ceremony and connection to the cosmos, became the cursed ruin where demons were summoned. The history was gone, but the emotion attached to it, the fear of a dark sacrificial magic, remained, becoming a permanent shadow in the cultural landscape of Europe. The Roman lie had been given a terrifying new life. For hundreds of years, this was the state of things. The Druid was either a forgotten name or a synonym for a devil-worshipping sorcerer. The connection to the wise philosopher, the judge, and the keeper of lore was almost completely severed. All that was left was the dark magic, the shadow of the Wicker Man, and the blood-soaked altar. The accusation, born of political convenience and nurtured by religious zeal, had successfully erased almost every other aspect of who the Druids were. It had become their defining characteristic. Then, during the Romantic era of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Druid was rediscovered. As we saw, some scholars tried to reinvent them as peaceful, nature-loving sages, but at the same time, another group of artists and writers were drawn to the opposite image. This was the time of the Gothic novel, a genre fascinated with horror, mystery, and the dark side of the past. For these writers, the Roman accounts of Druidic sacrifice were not something to be dismissed. They were a source of thrilling and terrifying inspiration. The image of the Wicker Man was rediscovered and embraced with morbid enthusiasm. Paintings and poems from this period depict horrifying scenes of mass sacrifices, with robed figures watching calmly as their victims burn. These artists were not trying to create a historically accurate picture. They were trying to evoke powerful emotions of terror and awe. The Druid became a stock character in Gothic horror, the sinister cult leader, the master of a bloody and ancient religion whose secrets were best left buried in the past. This created a strange paradox in the public imagination. The Druid was now two completely contradictory things at once. On one hand, you had the wise, gentle, white-robed philosopher of the Druid revival, peacefully meditating at Stonehenge. On the other hand, you had the dark, menacing, black-robed cultist of Gothic horror, plunging a ritual knife into a victim on a stone altar. Both images were almost entirely fictional, born from the hopes and fears of a modern era looking back at a dimly understood past. Imagine a person in the 19th century reading about the Druids. In one book, they are presented as the noble ancestors of the British people, enlightened thinkers who understood the secrets of nature. In another, they are the villains of a terrifying horror story, leaders of a death cult that haunted the ancient forests. This deep confusion is the direct result of the Druids' lost history. Because so little of their own words survived, they became a blank slate onto which later generations could project whatever they wanted to see: wisdom, peace, terror, or evil. In the 20th and 21st centuries, this dark image has proven to be incredibly powerful and persistent, especially in popular culture. Fantasy novels, horror movies, and video games have all drawn heavily on the idea of the evil Druid cult. The image of secretive, hooded figures performing sinister rituals in forest clearings or among ancient ruins is a common trope. This version of the Druid is often depicted as being fanatically devoted to the harsh, cruel aspects of nature, believing that blood and sacrifice are necessary to maintain its power. A perfect example is the famous 1973 horror film, The Wicker Man. The movie tells the story of a police officer who travels to a remote Scottish island to investigate a missing girl. he discovers that the islanders are members of a modern pagan cult that still practices the old ways. The film ends with the horrifying revelation that the Wicker Man is real and the officer himself is to be the human sacrifice. This film cemented the darkest image of the Druids and their supposed practices in the minds of millions of people. This popular culture version of the Druid is a fantasy, but it is a fantasy built on a 2,000-year-old foundation of fear. It takes the original Roman propaganda, mixes it with the Christian idea of demonic worship, and filters it through the lens of modern horror. It has very little to do with the actual historical Druids of the Iron Age, but it speaks to a deep and ancient fear within us. The fear of the wilderness, the fear of the unknown, and the fear that the forces of nature demand a terrible price for their favor. So the accusation of dark magic and human sacrifice became so persistent because it was useful. It was useful for the Romans, who needed to justify their conquest. It was useful for the early Christians, who needed to show that their God was more powerful and merciful than the old ones. And it has been useful for modern storytellers, who need a compelling and terrifying villain. The Druids themselves, unable to speak in their own defense, became the silent screen onto which all these fears were projected. The term dark magic, then, is really an outside perspective. It is the label given by those who did not understand, or who chose to misrepresent, the Celtic worldview. What they called dark magic was, from the inside, a profound connection to the cycles of life and death. The Celts and their spiritual leaders understood that nature could be both beautiful and brutal. The same sun that ripened the crops could also cause a drought. The same rain that nourished the fields could also bring a devastating flood. Their religion acknowledged this terrifying balance. Imagine living in a world where that balance feels very real and very immediate. A single failed harvest could mean your entire family starves to death over the winter. In that world, the idea of making a great offering to ensure the sun returns or the rains come is not an act of evil. It is a desperate, rational act aimed at survival. The darkness was not in their magic, but in the harsh reality of the world they lived in, a world where the line between life and death was incredibly thin. We must also remember their core belief in reincarnation. To the Druids, death was not an end. It was a transition to another life. This does not make the act of sacrifice any less violent, but it changes its spiritual meaning entirely. They may have believed they were not destroying a soul, but merely sending it on its journey to the other world, from where it would eventually return. It was a way of dispatching a messenger to the gods, a messenger who would be reborn. This is a profoundly alien worldview to us, but it is not one born of simple evil. The true magic of the Druids was their ability to hold all of this together. They were the intellectual force that maintained this complex understanding of the universe. They guided their people through a world that was both nurturing and terrifying. They understood that to receive the gift of life from the gods in the land, a gift had to be given in return. Most of the time, this was a portion of the harvest or an animal. Only in the most extreme circumstances, if at all, was the gift a human life. So the dark magic of the Druids has finally been explained. It was not a single thing, but a complex tapestry woven from 3 different threads. The first thread was the reality, a sophisticated belief system that acknowledged the harshness of nature, practiced by wise leaders in a challenging world. The second thread was the lie, a powerful story of bloodthirsty savages, created by their conquerors to justify their destruction. The third thread was the echo, the way this lie was transformed over centuries into a legend of demonic sorcerers and evil cults. Understanding this allows us to see the Druid for who they truly were. They were not peaceful hippies wandering through Stonehenge, nor were they black-robed villains from a horror movie. They were the intellectual and spiritual leaders of a vibrant and complex Iron Age culture. They were philosophers who pondered the nature of the soul, judges who upheld the law, and scientists who studied the stars. And they were priests who guided their people through the terrifying and beautiful mysteries of a world that they saw as being alive and filled with consciousness. We have peeled back the layers of propaganda and legend. We have cleared away the smoke of the wicker man and the shadows of the haunted grove. We are left with the ghost of a lost world, a world with a profoundly different understanding of reality. This journey has taken us from the forests of ancient Europe, through the courts of Irish kings, and into the pages of Gothic novels. We have seen how a people's soul can be stolen and replaced with a monstrous caricature. But this leads us to one final, essential question. After all this destruction, all this forgetting, and all this deliberate misrepresentation, is anything authentic left? The Druids' knowledge was never written down. Their sacred places were destroyed. Their very name was turned into a curse. Is it possible that any genuine trace of their worldview, their philosophy, or their magic has managed to survive the last 2,000 years? Or was their world so completely erased that all we have left are the faint, distorted echoes we have been exploring? The answer is not as simple as a yes or no. The most direct and tangible legacy of the Druids is found in the very languages that are still spoken in the Celtic parts of the world, like Irish, Welsh, and Scottish Gaelic. Language is not just a collection of words. It is a way of seeing the world. Within the structure and vocabulary of these languages are clues to the old Celtic worldview. Phrases and expressions can hold the memory of ancient beliefs, like a fossil holds the shape of a long extinct creature. They are a living connection to the distant past. Consider the way these languages often describe the world. There is a deep sense of place, a connection between people and the landscape that is woven into the grammar itself. Many place names still carry the names of the old gods and goddesses, turning a simple map into a mythological landscape. To speak these languages is to, in some small way, inhabit the mental world of the people who created them. It is a subtle but powerful echo of the Druidic belief that the land itself was a conscious and sacred entity. Another powerful echo survives in the great mythological cycles of Ireland and Wales, the very stories that were written down by the Christian monks. Even though the monks changed the stories to fit their new faith, they could not erase everything. Beneath the Christian surface, the old pagan soul of the stories is still visible. The tales are filled with the core themes of the Celtic world: the ever-present otherworld, the power of spoken words, the importance of honor, and the fluid boundary between the human and the divine. Reading these stories today is like looking at a beautiful old painting that has been painted over. If you look closely, you can still see the outlines of the original image showing through. The gods may have been turned into fairy kings and the goddesses into powerful queens, but their original nature is still there. These myths are the closest thing we have to a sacred text from the pre-Christian Celtic world. They are a treasure chest of information about how our ancestors saw the universe, a gift preserved by the very people who were trying to replace those beliefs. And what about the land itself? The physical landscape of the Celtic countries is dotted with thousands of ancient monuments, stone circles, burial mounds, and sacred hills. For centuries, these places were feared or ignored, but they never lost their power. Local folklore often attached magical stories to them, tales of fairies or sleeping giants. These stories were a way of remembering that these were special, powerful places. Even if the original reason had been forgotten, the landscape itself held the memory. Think of a farmer in rural Ireland plowing his field. He carefully avoids a certain large stone in the corner or a particular grove of hawthorn trees. Why? He might say it's bad luck to disturb them, that the good folk live there. He doesn't know that his great-great-great ancestors may have seen that stone as the home of a land spirit, or that grove as a sacred place. The belief has changed its form, from a conscious religion to a half-believed superstition, but the behavior, the act of respecting a sacred place, has survived for centuries. This brings us to the modern revival of Druidry, which began in the 18th century and continues to this day. Are these modern Druids practicing the same religion as the ancient ones? No, that is impossible. Too much has been lost forever. The original, unbroken chain of oral teaching was shattered. But modern Druidry is not trying to be an exact reconstruction. Instead, it is an attempt to reconnect with the spirit of the ancient Celtic worldview, using the sources that have survived. Modern Druids study the old myths, they learn about the archaeological discoveries, and they seek a deep, spiritual connection to the natural world. They celebrate the turning of the seasons, with festivals that are inspired by, but not identical to, the ancient ones like Samhain and Beltane. They see the divine not in a distant heaven, but in the sun, the earth, and the living landscape around them. It is an attempt to re-enchant the world, to find the magic that their ancestors knew was all around them. So the spirit of the Druids survives, not as a single unbroken tradition, but as a collection of scattered echoes. It survives in language, in myth, in folklore, and in the modern spiritual paths that seek to honor the ancient ways. The dark magic, the accusation that almost destroyed their memory, has ironically made them more fascinating. People are drawn to the mystery, and in seeking to understand the darkness, they often discover the brilliant light of the philosophy that lay behind it, a deep reverence for nature, a love of poetry and knowledge, and a profound sense of connection to the cycles of the cosmos. This entire journey brings us back to where we began, to the two opposing images of the Druid, the wise philosopher and the dark sorcerer. We can now see that neither image is the complete truth. The reality was something far more human and complex. The Druids were the intellectual leaders of their people, navigating a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. Their beliefs were not good or evil in our modern sense. They were a practical and spiritual response to the world as they experienced it. The magic of the Druids was not about violating the laws of nature. It was about understanding them so deeply that you could work with them. It was the belief that the human mind, through focused intention, poetry, and ritual, could communicate with the deeper intelligence of the cosmos. It was the understanding that a person is not separate from their environment, but a part of it. A change in one part of the web of life would be felt in all the others. This is a profoundly ecological worldview, one that we are only just beginning to appreciate again today. The darkness that became attached to them was not their own. It was a shadow cast upon them by others. It was the shadow of Roman imperial ambition, of Christian religious certainty, and of our own modern fascination with the horrific. For 2,000 years, we have been looking at the Druids through a distorted lens, seeing only the dark caricature that was created to serve the needs of others. By understanding how that caricature was made, we can finally begin to see the people who were hidden behind it. We live in a world that the ancient Druids would not recognize, a world of vast cities, of digital technology, of scientific materialism that often tells us the universe is a silent, empty machine. The belief in a conscious landscape, in an ever-present other world, in the magical power of the spoken word, seems like a distant fantasy. We have, in many ways, actively disenchanted our world, cutting ourselves off from the sense of mystery and wonder that was so central to the Celtic worldview. But the questions that the Druids asked are still with us. What is the nature of the soul? What is our right relationship with the natural world? How do we live a good life in a world of cycles, of birth, growth, and death? These are not ancient questions. They are human questions. The Druids' answers were rooted in their time and place, but the search for those answers is eternal. Their lost world serves as a powerful reminder of other ways of seeing, of other ways of being human. The final, and perhaps most important, piece of their worldview that has echoed down to us is the idea of balance. The balance between light and dark, between summer and winter, between this world and the other world. Their entire philosophy was based on maintaining this delicate equilibrium. They understood that life and death were not enemies, but partners in a great cosmic dance. A world of endless summer would be a desert. A world of endless life without death would be a stagnant horror. Both were needed for the wheel to turn. This idea of balance offers a profound lesson. The story of the Druids themselves became horribly unbalanced. Only the darkest parts of their story were remembered, creating the monstrous figure of legend. By seeking out the lost parts of their history, by understanding their philosophy and their worldview, we are, in a small way, restoring that balance. We are taking the monstrous caricature and making it human again, with all the light and shadow that being human entails. So when we see the image of a druid today, we can look past the cliches. We can see beyond the white-robed sage at Stonehenge and the black-robed cultist in the horror movie. We can see, however faintly, the real people who stood behind these masks. We can imagine the young student, spending 20 years of their life memorizing the sacred laws and poems of their people. We can imagine the judge, settling a dispute and preventing a war. We can imagine the philosopher, contemplating the eternal journey of the soul under the branches of a sacred oak. The dark magic of the Druids, the central mystery of our story, was ultimately the magic of perception. They saw a world that was alive, intelligent, and interconnected. Their conquerors saw a world of resources to be exploited and savages to be civilized. The conflict between these two ways of seeing has shaped much of our history. The story of the Druids is a tragic example of what happens when one worldview is completely and violently erased by another, and how long it can take for the truth to even begin to surface again. And this brings us to the final turn of our journey. We have untangled the threads of history, myth, and propaganda. We have explained the dark magic and placed it in its proper context. We can now return to the very beginning, to that first shocking image we were presented with. We were told of a wise man in a white robe and a savage sorcerer performing terrifying rituals. We were promised that the truth was something far stranger. It is now time to fulfill that promise completely. The truth is that the wise man and the sorcerer were the same person. They were never two different figures. They were two different ways of looking at one single, complex reality. To his own people, the Druid was the wise philosopher, the keeper of the sacred order, the voice of the gods. To his enemies, the Romans, he was the dark sorcerer, the instigator of rebellion, the practitioner of barbaric rites. The dark magic was not a substance that existed in the world. It was a perception, a label created by fear and hostility to describe a power that was not understood. Imagine a Celtic tribesman standing before his druid. He feels a sense of profound reverence and security. He sees a figure who understands the deep laws of the universe, who can ensure the harvest will be plentiful and the tribe will be safe. The druid is the anchor of his world, the embodiment of wisdom and stability. His power is a source of comfort and order. Now, imagine a Roman soldier seeing the same druid from a distance, standing on a misty hilltop, chanting to the sky. He feels a cold dread. He sees a savage, a witch doctor, calling on alien gods to destroy him. The magic itself does not change. What changes is the lens through which it is viewed. A prayer to a Celtic war goddess for victory is, to the Celtic warrior, a sacred and noble act. To the Roman soldier fighting against them, that same prayer is a terrifying curse, a piece of black magic aimed at his destruction. The darkness was always in the eye of the beholder. The Romans were not wrong to be afraid of the Druids' power. Their mistake, or their deliberate strategy, was to define that power as evil instead of simply other. This process of turning an enemy's culture into a source of horror is a timeless tactic of war. It is easier to fight a monster than it is to fight a person. By focusing on the most extreme and alien aspects of Celtic religion, like ritual sacrifice, the Romans could turn the Druids into monsters in the minds of their soldiers and citizens. The complex philosophy, the intricate legal system, the beautiful poetry, all of that was ignored. Only the darkness was shown because the darkness was useful. It was the justification for conquest. This is the strange truth we were promised. The dark magic of the Druids was not a set of forbidden spells or demonic pacts. It was the name given to a worldview that lost a war. It is the story of the defeated told by the victor. The winners, the Romans, and later the Christians, got to write the history books. They got to define the terms. And they defined the deep, nature-based spirituality of their predecessors as a dark and bloody superstition. They took the soul of a culture and gave it a monstrous face. And this explanation brings us to the final act of our story. We can now close the great loop that we opened at the very beginning. We have traveled through 2,000 years of history and myth to understand who the Druids were and what their magic truly meant. We have seen how their memory was twisted and transformed, becoming a source of both romantic inspiration and Gothic terror. Now we can see how the echoes of their lost world still ripple beneath the surface of our own, often in the most unexpected of places. The most visible legacy is in our modern celebrations. Halloween, for example, is a direct descendant of the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain. We may have replaced the great bonfires with carved pumpkins and the spirits of the ancestors with children in costumes, but the core idea remains. It is a night when the veil between the worlds is thin, a night of mischief and mystery, a time to acknowledge the darkness as the wheel of the year turns towards winter. The ghost of the Druids' most sacred festival is still walking among us. Think about the traditions of Halloween. We dress in costumes, originally to disguise ourselves from the wandering spirits. We go from door to door, a faint echo of old customs where people would go around the community gathering food for the festival feast. We tell ghost stories and watch horror movies, embracing the fear and mystery of the night. We are, without even knowing it, participating in a ritual that is thousands of years old, a ritual that our distant ancestors would have understood as the most important and dangerous night of the year. Other festivals also carry these echoes. May Day, with its maypoles and celebrations of spring, is a modern reflection of Beltane, the great festival of life and fertility. Even some of our Christmas traditions, like bringing an evergreen tree into the house, echo ancient pre-Christian practices of honoring nature and the promise of returning light during the darkest part of the winter. These customs survived because they were so deeply rooted in the seasonal cycles of Europe that they were simply absorbed into new traditions rather than being erased completely. The legacy also lives on in our stories. The entire modern genre of fantasy literature is deeply indebted to the mythological world that the Druids inhabited. The idea of the wise, wizardly advisor to the king, like Merlin or Gandalf, is a direct echo of the mythical Druid at the court of an Irish high king. The concept of an enchanted forest, of magical creatures, of a nearby otherworld filled with powerful, non-human beings. All of these ideas have their deepest roots in the soil of Celtic mythology. J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, was a scholar of ancient languages and myths. He was deeply inspired by the atmosphere of Northern European folklore. His elves, with their otherworldly grace and their deep connection to nature, have much in common with the fair folk of Celtic legend, the beings who were once the gods of the old world. The forests of his world are ancient and alive, just as they were for the Celts. He tapped into that deep pre-Christian sense of an enchanted landscape. Even the idea of magic in many fantasy stories owes a debt to the Druidic worldview. It is often a magic of words, of names, and of deep connection to the elements. It is not just about power, but about wisdom and understanding the hidden patterns of the world. This is a very different kind of magic from the explosive spells of a fairy tale. It is a more subtle, more naturalistic magic, one that feels ancient and deeply rooted in the earth. It is, in its essence, a romanticized version of what the Druids believed. The influence is also there in our relationship with the natural world. The modern environmental movement, with its emphasis on the interconnectedness of all living things and the sacredness of the earth, is in many ways a rediscovery of the core principles of the Druidic worldview. While the ancient Druids were not modern ecologists, Their belief in a conscious, living landscape and the need for balance and respect is a philosophy that resonates powerfully with many people today who are concerned about the health of our planet. When we speak of Mother Earth or feel a sense of spiritual peace in a pristine forest, we are touching upon the same feelings that were central to the Celtic world. We are recognizing on some intuitive level that our connection to nature is not just a physical one. It is also an emotional and spiritual one. This feeling, which was the very foundation of the Druids' reality, has survived centuries of a worldview that tried to teach us that nature was just a machine, a collection of resources for us to use. Imagine a modern person hiking deep into the mountains. They reach a clearing, surrounded by ancient trees, and they feel a sense of awe and peace. They feel small, but also connected to something vast and ancient. In that moment, they are sharing an experience with their Celtic ancestors. They are feeling the spirit of the place, the genius loci, that the Romans themselves recognized. This quiet, personal experience is perhaps the most authentic surviving echo of the Druids' world. The sacred grove is gone, but the feeling it inspired can still be found. The Druids' legacy also continues in the modern spiritual movements that bear their name. For the thousands of people around the world who call themselves Druids today, the path is one of seeking wisdom, creativity, and a harmonious relationship with the earth. They are not trying to be Iron Age priests. They are trying to take the inspirational elements of the ancient philosophy, the love of nature, the respect for ancestors, the pursuit of knowledge, and apply them to the challenges of the modern world. It is a living, evolving tradition. These modern Druids plant trees. They help clean up their local environments, they study the old myths, and they create new ceremonies to mark the changing seasons. For them, the magic is in the act of connection. It is the magic of watching a seed grow, of learning the names of the birds in your garden, of feeling the turn of the seasons in your own body. It is a quiet, gentle magic, far removed from the terrifying images of the past. It is an attempt to re-enchant their own lives and their own small corners of the world. And so, the Druid has completed a remarkable journey. They began as a powerful, respected leader. They were then turned into a monstrous villain by their conquerors. They were forgotten for 1,000 years, remembered only as a dark legend. They were then reinvented as both a peaceful sage and a gothic horror. And now, in our time, the name is being reclaimed by people who see in it a powerful symbol of a lost connection to the natural world. The Druid has become a symbol of what was lost and what might yet be found again. The dark magic that was their curse has, in a strange way, become their enduring mystery. The fascination with the Wicker Man and the forbidden rituals is often what draws people to their story in the first place. It is a hook, a dark and compelling mystery. But for those who look deeper, who go past the Roman propaganda and the horror stories, they find something else entirely. They find a sophisticated and beautiful worldview, a philosophy of balance and connection that is more relevant today than it has ever been. The story of the Druids is a powerful cautionary tale. It shows how easily the history of a people can be rewritten by those who defeat them. It reminds us to always question the stories we are told, especially the stories about our enemies. It shows us that what one culture calls wisdom, another might call dark magic. The difference is often not in the act itself, but in the fear and lack of understanding of the person watching. The Druids were the first victims of a story that has been told many times since. We have finally explained the dark magic of the Druids. We have seen that it was a complex blend of historical reality, deliberate propaganda, and centuries of legendary transformation. We have untangled the knot and revealed the separate threads that were woven together to create the sinister figure of legend. We have placed their beliefs and practices back into their own world, a world where such things made a terrifying kind of sense. The mystery has been solved, the promise has been kept. And yet, a true sense of mystery remains. Because their knowledge was oral, We will never know the full details of their philosophy. We will never hear the great epic poems as they were originally recited. We will never fully understand the intricate meanings behind their rituals. We have the echoes, the fragments, the stories told by their descendants, and the reports written by their enemies. But the inner sanctuary of their wisdom is lost to time. They will always keep some of their secrets. Perhaps this is as it should be. The enduring mystery of the Druids is what keeps them so compelling. They remind us that the past is not a closed book. It is a landscape of shadows and whispers, a place that we can never fully map or understand. They represent the profound otherness of the deep past, the humbling realization that there were entire worlds of thought and spirit that are now almost completely beyond our reach. They are the ghosts of a lost consciousness. To stand in the ruins of an ancient stone circle today is to feel this mystery in a powerful way. You can feel the weight of the centuries. You can wonder about the people who built it, what they believed, and what ceremonies they performed in that very spot. You are standing in the wreckage of a lost world. The knowledge of how to use this place is gone, but the power of the place itself, its ability to inspire awe and wonder, remains. That feeling is a direct connection to the world of the Druids. So we are left with a final, more complete picture. The Druids were the guardians of a worldview that saw the entire cosmos as a living, interconnected being. Their magic was the art and science of maintaining a harmonious relationship with that being. Their tragedy was that they encountered another culture, the Romans, whose worldview was based on conquest and assimilation. In the conflict that followed, the Druids' world was shattered, and their memory was deliberately darkened by their destroyers. The story did not end there. That darkened memory took on a life of its own, transforming through the centuries into a powerful legend. This legend, in all its contradictory forms, has survived to the present day, influencing our holidays, our stories, and even our spiritual ideas. The Druids may have been defeated, but they were never truly erased. Their ghost has haunted our culture for 2,000 years, a persistent reminder of a different way of seeing the world. Our journey has been a long one. We have stepped back in time into the misty forests of ancient Europe. We have tried to see the world through the eyes of the Celtic people, a world where the gods were as real as the rain. We have met the Druids, the keepers of this sacred worldview, and we have explored the nature of their power. We have witnessed their brutal destruction at the hands of Rome, and we have followed the strange and twisted path of their memory through the centuries that followed. We have seen how the accusation of dark magic was a political weapon, a tool used to turn a respected leader into a feared monster. We have understood that this darkness was not a quality of the Druids themselves, but a shadow cast upon them by their enemies. In doing so, we have not excused the harsh realities of their world, but we have rescued them from the cartoonish villainy of legend and restored to them their complex humanity. We have, in effect, reversed the ancient propaganda. The ultimate truth about the Druids is not that they were good or evil. It is that they were different. Their reality was fundamentally different from our own. They lived in a world of circles, not lines, a world where the soul was immortal and the landscape was alive. To try and judge them by our own standards is to miss the point entirely. To understand them, we must try, for a moment, to step into their world and see with their eyes. Only then does the dark magic reveal itself for what it was. It was the power of a people who were deeply, profoundly, and sometimes terrifyingly at home in their world. It was the wisdom of a culture that knew its place in the great, turning wheel of the cosmos. It was a connection to the forces of life and death that we, in our modern, brightly lit world, have long since forgotten. And that, more than any whispered spell or secret ritual, is the truest and most enduring magic of the Druids. It is the magic of belonging to the world, not just living on it. So the next time you see a gnarled oak tree in a quiet forest, perhaps you will see it a little differently. You might see it not just as a plant, but as a silent witness. A living being with a memory that stretches back far beyond your own. You might remember that for 1,000 years, people saw that tree as a gateway to another world, a sacred place where one could speak to the gods. You might feel a faint echo of the belief that gave the Druids their name, the Oak Knowers. The next time you feel the chill in the air on a late October evening, you might remember Samhain. You might think of the great bonfires that once pushed back a darkness that was believed to be real and filled with spirits. You might feel that ancient primal thrill of a night when the borders of the ordinary world dissolve and anything seems possible. You will be feeling the same mix of fear and excitement that your distant ancestors felt as they gathered close to their families to face the coming of winter. And the next time you hear a story about a wizard who advises a king, or an enchanted forest that is alive with ancient power, you will know where that idea came from. You will recognize the ghost of the mythical druid, the memory of a real spiritual leader that was transformed into a legend. You will see the deep roots of our modern fantasy stretching all the way back to the myths and beliefs of the ancient Celtic peoples, preserved for us in the manuscripts of medieval monks. The world of the Druids is gone. We cannot bring it back. Its sacred groves have returned to common soil, its oral wisdom has faded into silence, and its gods are now only the stuff of folklore and fairy tales. But the questions they wrestled with, and the deep sense of connection they felt to the world around them, are a legacy that has not been completely lost. It has simply been sleeping, waiting in the old stories and the quiet places of the land to be rediscovered. Their story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of memory. Even after centuries of suppression and misrepresentation, the faint outline of their world can still be traced. It is a reminder that no history is ever truly erased. It just goes underground, surviving in the margins, in the folklore, in the very language we speak, waiting for a time when people are willing to listen to its whispers once again. The Druids are gone, but their echoes are everywhere. And so we arrive at the very end of our story. We can now fully and completely answer the question that we posed in our opening scene. We saw the two images, the grinning pumpkin on our doorstep and the human head used as a ward against soul-stealing creatures. How did one become the other? The answer to this specific riddle was never directly stated, because the riddle itself was a metaphor for our entire journey. The pumpkin is the modern, sanitized echo. The severed head is the terrifying, misunderstood reality of the ancient world. The journey from the sacred head to the Halloween pumpkin is the story of the Druids in miniature. It is a story of transformation, of forgetting, and of reinterpretation. The Celts revered the head as the seat of the soul, a source of spiritual power and protection. It was a deeply serious and sacred object. The Romans saw this practice and labeled it as a barbaric and gruesome custom, part of the dark magic of a savage people. This was the first step in the transformation. The sacred was redefined as the horrific. Then, as Christianity spread, the old traditions were either suppressed or absorbed. The festival of Samhain, a time for honoring ancestors and warding off dangerous spirits, was reframed as All Hallows' Eve. The old practices lost their original meaning. The tradition of warding off evil spirits survived, but it was detached from its deep philosophical roots. People continued to carve scary faces, but now they carved them into turnips or other vegetables, a folk custom whose original, grimmer purpose was fading from memory. The horrific was slowly being tamed into the folkloric. Finally, this folk tradition traveled with Irish and Scottish immigrants to America, where the large, native pumpkin was adopted as the perfect vegetable for carving. In the commercialized, modern world, the last vestiges of real fear and sacredness were stripped away. The terrifying, soul-filled head, which had become a ghoulish turnip to ward off demons, was finally transformed into the friendly, grinning pumpkin of a children's holiday. The folkloric became the festive. One did not become the other overnight. It was a slow, 2,000-year process of forgetting. This single transformation perfectly mirrors the journey of the Druids' reputation. The sacred philosopher, revered by his people, was first turned into a horrific sorcerer by his enemies. This horrific sorcerer was then tamed into the folkloric wizard of medieval legend. And finally, that wizard was transformed into the often friendly, sometimes silly figure of modern fantasy. The pumpkin on our doorstep is a symbol of how much has been lost, how a deep and serious worldview can be slowly hollowed out over centuries until only the cheerful, empty shell remains. Understanding this journey allows us to look at our own world with new eyes. It encourages us to see the deep history that lies hidden just beneath the surface of our modern customs. It reminds us that the things we take for granted often have strange and surprising origins, rooted in worlds of belief that are profoundly different from our own. The past is not dead. It is not even past. It is here with us now, in the games our children play, and the stories we tell. The story of the Druids is not just about a group of ancient priests. It is about the very nature of history itself. It shows us that history is not a collection of facts, but a story that is constantly being told and retold. And who gets to tell that story is a matter of power. For centuries, the story of the Druids was told by those who had conquered them. Now we have the chance to listen more closely, to hear the fainter voices, and to piece together a more balanced and more truthful account. We have seen that the dark magic of the Druids was a complex phenomenon, born from a worldview that saw the universe as alive and interconnected. It was a reality where death was not an end, and where the forces of nature required respect and sometimes terrible sacrifice. This reality was frightening to outsiders, and that fear was used as a weapon to destroy it. The darkness was not in the magic itself, but in the story that was later told about it. This journey has been an act of historical restoration. We have scraped away the layers of paint that were applied by Romans, by Christians, by Gothic novelists, and by modern filmmakers. We have tried to reveal the faint outlines of the original image beneath. That image is incomplete, it is faded and full of holes, but it is, for the first time, a picture of the Druids as they might have understood themselves, the intellectual and spiritual heart of a vibrant and complex world. They were not monsters, and they were not saints. They were human beings, grappling with the great mysteries of existence in the best way they knew how. Their world was destroyed, but the power of their ideas was so great that it has continued to echo through time, shaping our world in ways we are only just beginning to understand. Their story is a powerful reminder that even when a culture is silenced, its voice is never truly lost forever. To seek the Druids is to seek a part of ourselves that has been long dormant. It is to seek a connection to the deep past, to the land beneath our feet, and to the enduring power of the natural world. It is to remember a time when the world was not a thing to be used, but a story to be lived, a poem to be recited, and a great mystery to be honored. The Druids were the keepers of that mystery. So the next time you look up at the night sky, think of the people who saw in its patterns not just balls of gas, but the map of destiny itself. The next time you walk in a forest, think of the people for whom every tree and every stone had a spirit and a name. The next time you feel the turn of the seasons, think of the people who believed their rituals were essential to keep the great wheel of the cosmos in motion. By remembering them, we do more than just learn about the past. We expand our own understanding of what it means to be human. We are reminded that our modern scientific worldview is not the only way of seeing. It is just one story among many. The story of the Druids, with all its light and all its darkness, offers us a glimpse into a different kind of reality, a different kind of magic. The dark magic of the Druids, once a label of condemnation, can now be understood for what it truly was: the profound and challenging wisdom of a lost world. It was a worldview that embraced the whole of existence, the beautiful and the terrifying, the creative and the destructive, life and death, all held in perfect, precarious balance. Their greatest secret was not a spell or an incantation. It was a way of seeing. And it is in the act of trying to see the world through their eyes that we find their final, enduring legacy. They challenge us to look at our own world and ask, what have we forgotten? What have we lost? In a world that often feels disconnected and disenchanted, the ghost of the Druid stands as a silent, powerful question, an invitation to listen once more to the quiet, ancient magic of the world itself.